Welcome, everyone. Time for another exciting adventure into the occult sciences. I am Grand Master Dr. Thor Templar, and as usual, I will be your guide through this amazing, mysterious, and empowering journey into the unknown, which soon will be known to you. So it's time to relax, turn off the mind, that toxic trash hole that is going to tell you different things, has no value, and stop thinking and start being. What I want to cover today is Carlos Castaneda, the famous author from the 70s, and his series of books about Don Juan. And it's a very interesting series of books, and I have to say, extremely well written and fascinating works of occultism. Extremely well written. I mean, you rarely do you see these types of high authorships and put together so well as they were. And he has recently passed, and as most things that happen, of course, information comes out and certain things of what's happened. And, you know, how much credibility we can take on gossip or what an ex-wife states is pretty clarified by when you put the X in front of that. So, and you have to really wonder, people who come out and criticize their past husbands or whatever, what their motives are in general, to mess up someone's name, so to speak, to cloud their image in general. And I don't know how much she got or not got from those books, but you would think that, I'm assuming, I don't know where all the royalties are going, but she must have made some money off of that. So, as usual, she's biting the hand that feeds her. With certain criticisms. But, you know, we have to understand that the illusionary factor of what people portray to the public as true occultism and what it actually is in life is quite a bit different. And as I've said many times in my different audios, it's not really the author or the organization's problem that you have to feed the fantasy reality of the customer, or you won't be there, which is why the most highly paid and the most seen performer in the history of entertainment is, who would you think that is? David Copperfield. So as long as you can give people a good fake illusionary show, they will pay you millions. I think he owns an island, has tons of money, and from what I understand is a pretty bad chap in general. But I don't know. Everyone I've known who's met him, which has been a few, don't like him, and the publicity in the media and so forth of his general attitude seems to be pretty poor from movie stars I've seen on TV shows that talk about him and his terrible cheapness on top of everything else when the guy is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Who gives concierge $1 and tells him to go get chicks for him. So that's not from me, that's from people on there. So here we go again. Of course, that's diverting from the topic here, which I do love to do. But all in all, we need to understand of what the fact is from the reality and what is created by the fact of that, you know, you don't want to make a textbook. Similar to, you know, things like Uri Geller has done, and the fact is that, well, he has to make a whole show. You know, if you bend spoons for 2 hours every night, you're not going to get much of a showing of people. So the whole idea is you've got to put in a lot of dressing and a lot of illusions into the reality with it. And I think that's exactly what's happened with Geller, who has been proven under scientific conditions to have abilities. Now, does he have the abilities, and has he ever done magic tricks as well as that? And the point is, yes, he has. And he pretty much has stated that if you read his books and so forth. He needs to make a living. He needs to be an entertainer. And I don't think too many people are going to lay out $150 for a Uri Geller ticket to get a bent spoon. So, I mean, you know, it's important to understand that. And of course, that brings us to Castaneda in terms of how he writes and so forth. Now, I don't know who really took all that stuff 100% serious, but when they were written, and a lot of people still today seem to be living in this fantasy world, that these kind of extreme abilities are out there to be harvested and used by everybody. Now, there are people with extreme abilities. And of course, everyone wants to have extreme abilities. Basically, let's get real, everybody listening to this. I mean, you get into occultism, maybe initially to practical occultism to take care of maybe some basic problems. But in the back of your head, like everybody is, there's two things everybody wants to be: rich and a superhero. And you may not want to save the world with that wealth or with those superhero abilities, but it certainly is nice to be in a position where you can have complete and total control, which is what superheroes basically have. And the only way that they ever, in all of the comic books, is they have to go against some other superhero or supervillain, because everybody else is already, forget it, man. If you're Superman, who's going to bother you? So you're going to have something that is equally menacing as you to be able to handle that. So it's important to understand that. And the concepts that Castaneda goes into, I must say, are very profound and fascinating, and are based in a interesting understanding of very inner order type belief systems. And one of the reasons that Castaneda was so popular was the timing of his books as well. I don't know how well they're selling now, but I'm assuming they still are, and I recommend his books to everyone. They really are well-written, fun, and thought-provoking literature. But in terms of the fact of what is stated here that can be done or not, is, of course, like so many other questionable empowerments. But you're also talking about that occultism tends to be an individual path. There has been some organized occult groups, and these, unfortunately, as we want to base historically, have all failed to really do anything to even save their own lives. So we have to be careful of those. But you got to remember, the individual themselves is very muted in their ability to handle major aggressions of society against them. Pure and simple numbers. You'd have to be virtually a god or Superman to handle massive attacks against you by organized large groups. It just is very difficult. As an individual practitioner, you can take care of individuals in certain situations and problems, but you can't go against masses of people, generally meaning armies or groups that are coming after you. So that's important to understand as well. But, one of the things that throughout the novels that everybody really loved is that it was a big excuse for taking drugs and the shamanic path. In the past, many, many years ago, and I guess even if you do it today, if you place an ad in some sort of paper, or, well, that dates me a little bit, but you place an ad on the internet and you put shamanism, and you get you get all the same people contacting you. Yeah, what drugs you using, man? I took some peyote last night with a Mountain Dew, and I saw God. I mean, this is the kind of people you get. And that's the problem with so many of these psychedelic or vision quest people. And it's so popular because life is so boring. Nobody really is going to spend 10 years in meditation or not orgasming through tantra and trying to get all these higher states of consciousness. Give me a drug, man. Boom, you're in the state. And I certainly understand that and am very, very sympathetic to that. And we all know that this long, drawn-out progression, particularly in Western society, which we see very little value to, and unfortunately, there is great value to it in the long run, but you're not seeing anything happening in a world that, you have to take care of yourself now. So there is a great interest and appeal to all that, and we need to recognize that. But, that's one reason why I caught off. It was at a time when there was very heavy drug use, particularly in psychedelics at that time, that were popular. And this was the start of course, what's culminating today with the legalization of an herb that should have never been illegal to begin with, called marijuana, which everybody is now using recreationally, which of course everyone wants to stop because It's something that kind of turns you off to the panic of the world. With unlike alcohol, that actually causes all sorts of problems and is such an inhibitor that it brings out lower natures of people, or in a lot of people. But not that everyone who takes marijuana, people think it just mellows you out and you're hungry, but it's also been used throughout the ages to make you kind of feel neutral, so you go out and kill people. So it's been used by warrior groups for years and years and years. Something that they don't want to talk about, but of course is true as well. But there was that great appeal to this, and if you could tie that in with a new type of spiritualism, which is the being spiritual to the belief systems based on Don Juan, had some particular appeal. And of course, Castaneda, who has a racial background of being a Mexican and coming from Southern California, based it in something that he was familiar with, but may, at that particular time, as hard as it is to believe, and it is really hard to believe, there is very few Mexicans in America at that particular time, particularly comparative to now that they're half or more of the population in the United States within 30 years. So, but it basically was a culture very few people knew about. Writing about a culture that was based in Mexico and the deeper aspects of Mexico, beyond the tourist traps of Tijuana, etc., was something that you could easily state, and no one really could check that very well. And not to be in a negative particular fashion, but it's a statement of fact, is that the generally lower level Hispanics and Mexicans are that educated. They're not readers, they're not educated, they don't go to school, and it has nothing to do with any kind of negativity. It's a state of fact. I'm not sure that, I don't think higher education benefits most of anybody, but of course they don't value that. They're family-based people. It's all about surviving, having kids, and that is the society based on particularly on the average or low-level Mexican, who were the typical types that would then flee their country for better opportunities in America. Generally, when you're educated, you're making enough money there, you don't have to worry about that. So the whole idea is that with all these things in terms of that, so it caught into that drug craze, which really was a drug craze at that time, where people were taking everything. It was everywhere. And it's amazing considering the horrible penalties that were portrayed. And there are people in jail right now for marijuana that all should be released, of course. But, makes money for the man. But billions for the man. It's an industry. And there are people in Texas for having a couple of seeds of marijuana plants who are there for life. Pretty silly when now it's going to be pretty much legal all over the country, and certainly should be. Any state that doesn't is a state you shouldn't be in, because of the fact that they're throwing away billions in revenues and everything else for something that is virtually inane in terms of its negativity impact. People want things. Life sucks. If you want people off drugs, make life better. Pay them well, number one, which don't happen around the world. But of course, that won't happen. But it also amazes me how much money is out there when people really want to spend it. I don't have money for this. I don't have money for that. Yeah, $10 billion a month in pot sales in Colorado. Where's all the money coming from, man? But the point is that it's all very interesting when you get into that. So there's a large part of that going through, and the shamanic drugs that are used there are demonstrated and used in a very formal setting, which you have to be very careful when you're using things like peyote and other things, that they are used properly and carefully, and you should be doing it in an atmosphere that where there are professionals there who have dealt with this before, instead of just doing it on your own, which is ayahuasca now, where people go to Central America and so forth, and they go to places. And generally these are places that, and hopefully, and if you go there, it should be supervised with people who have hundreds of people that do this all the time and know how to deal with anything if there's a negativity that happens. But I have discussed an audio, and I don't want to get too much into magic and drugs because I have an audio on that, and I don't want to go over that information again because of the value of hallucinogenics in general. That you can listen to that to get that more information. But getting back to Castaneda and there. So the whole idea is that came out at a very good time, and people took this book because, of course, if you want to take drugs, you got to believe that the book itself is 100%. It's very conveniently to believe it's 100% true to do that. But as with everything, you always get into the typical conundrum and problem of occultism, which is, does the story, does the gossip, does the fantasy, does the history, does anything connected to occultism in general add up to what the average person can experience in life? And this is always a problem on many, many levels. But, so they became very popular because of that, and then they've sold millions and millions of copies, and I don't know how many of the books there are, but I have all of them. I've read each one of them, and as I said, it's an excellent, interesting read, and very thought-provoking. His concepts, his spiritual understandings are all very, very valid in a very high inner order magical way, which is, I think, the icing on the cake that has made those books so interesting and so popular as well. It's pretty much like in recent times, the Matrix movies, and the actual philosophical statements in those, and what was portrayed on the screen around all this fantastic sci-fi special effects and fight scenes, really makes what everybody loves, which is kind of action and what people are doing. So it takes that, which in itself is fun, but doesn't really have the impact unless you tie it into a higher and deeper concept. So he basically did that as well by tying it into a higher and deeper concept of the drug taking, made something that would be commonly poo-pooed as just another hippie book into something that was based in a philosophical perspective, just as The Matrix is taken, instead of just another action movie. It's really a very philosophical action movie and gives you that extra bit of interest and thinking for the thinking man, and makes it really fascinating and profound, and which you're not going to get from your typical other action films. And action without something behind it for some reasons becomes kind of boring after a while, no matter how well it's done, and may get some credit for the action itself, but isn't taken in the same serious fashion. So tying that all in together with the Castaneda's viewpoint, which he did there, is all a fascinating and exciting path to explore. And to get back into some things about Castaneda himself, it's very interesting, and of course makes it even harder to trace, as I was saying, something based in this Mexican belief system. But Castaneda was not Mexican at all. He was Latin, of course, but he was from Peru. That's where he was born. And of course, the philosophical understandings that are throughout his novels are really based in a much older shamanic tradition, coming from a much more sophisticated society than, of course, the Mexican society, and or the general Latin societies as well. But as much as these places are poor, a lot of these areas are extremely hidden in terms of the fact that you just don't go to these places and get information because of the lack of educational facilities, because of the lack of book publishing and people who write. You're not going to find a very easily found tradition throughout that. There's been a few books written on the shamanic and witchcraft tradition from these entire Latin America, from Peru as well, and they're very simplistic, typical shamanistic things. And of course, they're very much based on the individual, the village, and the culture of that particular place where the shaman comes from. So the idea is that these are very difficult to trace systems. Well, like all magical systems, some are, of course, the conquistadors and the occupation of these areas went through horrible inquisitions where people were brutally murdered by the tens of thousands. So they went through similar things. I'm not sure if people are even aware of that. It was just not the conquering of these places. The Inquisition went in there and made sure they stomped out all the indigenous religious and shamanic belief systems so that they could get rid of any leaders that way. The typical things that are done throughout societies to do that. I mean, actually, the Aztecs did the same thing with the Mayans and killed them and burnt their books as well. So it's not a Christian thing. It's a people thing. So he wrote 12 books. Which sold 28 million copies, and they have been translated into 17 languages. So you can understand this great appeal. And when you get into, there's a few things that are very universal in the human condition, and that is sex and drugs. And if you can hit the right chord on that, like the silly 50 Shades of Grey books and all that stuff, popular pornography and on a jokey level, but since it's popular, I guess people think, well, it's okay. I don't want to read no porno magazines. I'll read this because it's it's in Barnes and Noble. So if you touch into that, or you touch into drugs, and then you'll actually be able to have a chance of being very popular. So. But it is beyond the fact of just those issues. And as I've mentioned, these are very, very well written and filled with deep philosophical understandings and concepts, which appears to me he obviously got from sources that are certainly profound and deep. And of course, his traditions are not, again, Mexican, so I've kind of misstated at the beginning of this. He claims a lot of his stuff came from the Toltecs, which we know very little about, which I believe was pre-Aztec, pre-Mayan. The Toltecs, not much is known about them, but they were almost like this superhuman group that controlled things, very similar to the Etruscans, who built up who basically ran Rome and were the people that brought most of the knowledge and information into the Roman societies, and of course were for a long period of time, and then of course were then pushed out by the Romans themselves, which the Etruscans were more of an Atlantean type tribe. He also, of course, did get a PhD from UCLA, University of Southern California, of Los Angeles, I'm sorry. And so it wasn't the fact that this guy was some just writer and he was uneducated. I mean, getting a PhD, and UCLA is an excellent school. So he certainly, and was an anthropologist. So, I mean, he's got degrees in this from a top college and everything else. So, he has all the things that everybody in society likes to look at. And the fact is, we certainly can't say that this was some ignorant Hispanic or Latin who didn't know anything. And even if that was the case, I don't know what ignorant means. The fact is that not being trained in Western goofball schools means absolutely nothing to me as an occultist. So the whole idea is that he certainly has all this to people who want to criticize him summarily. And so certainly this was a well-educated, well-versed, intelligent man, meaning he could write very well. That's what his Western schooling did for him. But he was able to achieve high levels. I mean, it takes a long time to get a PhD, and coming from Peru, I'm assuming he had very little resources. So the point is he had to get grants and educational benefits to go through this program, which means he had to perform at a high level in his common education to be able to get to higher levels. He did die in April 27th, 1998. So it's been a while now, I believe, I will check on that, of cancer. Um, and at the age of 72, which isn't exactly old, especially for someone who's supposed to be so shamanically based, you think he would be able to find these great healers and magicians to help him a little more. But that puts together the bigger puzzle here, which we'll talk about as well. So we need to look at the bigger picture of all of this, considering his cultural background. Apparently, he did spend a lot of time in Mexico as well, particularly northern Mexico, which gets back to this very untraceable aspect I covered already based on the lack of written knowledge from there. But of course, there's a lack of written knowledge from all traditions. And the only written knowledge we have based in European backgrounds are written by a bunch of priests. Those are the only people that really were trained to write and wrote things down. So I had to filter through these particular people. And what we have today, particularly in older documents, no matter what they are, even the lesser Christianized witchcraft tradition, is based in a very Christian philosophy, which is how all the grimoires are written. They're all written by priests and put in very Christian belief systems, which you got to remember go back 2,000 years to begin with. So going back more than 2,000 years in general in literature is pretty tough to do and figure out what's going on, and hardly anything in terms of what's been found has been translated. And so much has been found that nobody knows anything about or how to translate whatsoever. So well, that's something to consider as well. But he claimed that most of his knowledge came from a particular Toltec tradition, and that he learned this in northern Mexico, obviously after he immigrated to the United States from Peru. So he has this mixed, interesting culture there, and we're not really sure, since, nobody of any kind of magical background ever talked with him properly or wrote it down. Too many pseudo-intellectual people who are anthropologists or drug taker researchers are all the people who wrote and talked about him. And while he was really popular, of course, everybody jumps on the bandwagon and supports people. And the minute this changes a little and they don't see any great benefits, I guess, for themselves, the popularity wanes a little. As usual, they tend to turn on the particular person. And, of course, they don't see these things in the proper aspects of they are as actual magical text. And you're talking about, to a certain extent, a personal grimoire, written by a person who is whacked out of his head on hallucinogens. So your basic recall of what happened and putting the things together in a written form is going to be a little difficult to begin with. So I really think that there were experiences that he went through. What was put in the books in terms of the extreme abilities and some of the things that have happened. Like any writer, you add things in and you extrapolate on things to make them more interesting and more profound so the reader gets the impact of what you're trying to state. So if something has a great spiritual impact on someone, to amplify that as an author, you're probably going to say that something physical happened when it was probably something that was more spiritually happening. But I mean, that's as a writer and as an entertainer that you must do, unless you're writing a boring, dry history book, which really nobody wants to read. And of course, any types of these writings, as you can go through any metaphysical-based writings, any occult writings whatsoever, can be easily picked apart as having no proof, of not being true, of doing this. And this is the problem, especially coming from people who are semi-educated in these fields or not. But, just being educated as an anthropologist, as a studier of Indian culture and tribes, is not enough knowledge. And putting your toe into and testing the waters of magical practices and other things doesn't qualify you to make statements past a certain level. But of course, everyone does, and of course, unless a true occultist looks at these things, you can't find out what the value is. The value is the value, as with most metaphysical information, is what you take from it and what you gain from it and what it triggers in the inner magical being for you to learn, know, and grow with at that particular period of time. Instead of looking at it as some sort of textbook or even as some sort of grimoire. And his books are far from that. There's very little knowledge in terms of practical information there that you can gain as in a grimoire. There's very few step-by-step ways of doing anything. And so there's very little practicality in the books, and it's all based on the fact of getting some experience from the actual result from communicating with the spirit of the hallucinogen, the peyote, etc. And these, of course, are heavy hallucinogens that affect the mind. And as I said, this is a whole other topic into itself. And can anything that's generated through an hallucinogen have value? And to what extent, if it does? So then taking this information and putting it down on paper and trying to explain it in an interesting, fun, and yet factual way is a challenge that every occult writer goes through of any value. And he certainly was a master at it, as I've said at the beginning of this lecture, is that these books are extremely well written, which is why they are so popular. And of course, people go into his private life, what actually happened, and we don't seem to know much about that. And there are questions of marriages. Apparently had a child and was alienated for some reason. Strange things happened before his death, writing a will 2 days before he died of liver cancers, I just recall. Which you think, as he said, some healing practices could have helped him with those things. And apparently he was still heavily involved with this, had the money, and yet was unable to deal with this to any great extent. So there's this whole questionable thing. Apparently he had his own group of followers, which tended to be a bunch of women, which is not overly surprising. And as usual, fell into the easy trap that most people do who are popular in any way, is they fall into the sexual trap of having readily available people, and thus this becomes an important part of his life. But we don't know that much about him without going into all sorts of other readings from other people of what his social life was all about. And I'm not sure that means anything. You can't judge people by what they're doing. You do as what I say, not as I do, and some people find that to be a terrible statement, but I think it's very true in life, is that, just because you are doing something differently doesn't mean that than what you state. It doesn't necessarily make you bad at that. It just means you're working in life to handle that. So this is throughout history of people who preach don't necessarily follow what they preach, and I don't believe that's necessarily deliberate in most of the cases. It's just that a person is working out their own particular struggles. But needless to say, apparently he indulged himself with multi-apprentices and they seem to have been all females. Upon his death, his little group broke up with some strange happenings there, where the people actually just kind of disappeared. One of them apparently committed suicide in Death Valley, one of the women, and etc. So it doesn't necessarily seem to be. But, again, from an occult viewpoint, the fact of necessarily picking your time of death in a, quote, suicide is not necessarily that surprising or even that dramatic. I mean, unfortunately, you should be leaving the people that you train in a position for them to carry on. I'm not sure that death in the bigger picture It doesn't help the situation. You should be going on and taking your training and understanding and passing that on to others instead of ending when your mentor ends or whatever guru or leader that is, and just moving on with that seems to me to be a complete waste of time. But it's not unusual in these type of situations. But it does show a poor leadership on his part, that people didn't carry on what he was doing, and he didn't train people to a level that they could go out on their own, which apparently, as I said, these 4 or 5 women he was involved with have disappeared. And but again, it's part of the philosophy, particularly of his shamanic and drug-based reality, that you're not going to be all that public, and you're not going to have public groups, because you're going to get into all sorts of legal problems with the fact of that you have and are using things that are very illegal and can carry lifetime imprisonment penalties if you're caught doing it. So it's not all that understandable, and neither are cult organizations in general open like this is some sort of institute of learning in general. Most of the time there isn't even the financial support to keep these things going. But it's the nature of all occult and metaphysical groups to not be a sustainable group, and the information is meant to be kept to a few. And if those in the group, as was demonstrated here, don't continue the work once a founder or leader leaves, you have a particular problem here. And of course, a lot of people have attacked him and his writings and everything else, saying, well, you don't get this feeling on peyote, you don't do. Well, that's their opinion again. And I don't know how you can tell somebody's particular personal reaction within a structured shamanic condition and say this is true and this is not true. I find questionable at best. Getting into the details of metaphysical and occult happenings and quantifying them, measuring them to say whether they are valid or not, is a very dangerous ground to step. You have to be careful and take it in the bigger picture of does this have general value? But of course there are things as well that are, valid criticisms. Things don't fit into a basic structure. And there are just some great misnomers out there that people do in all stages that, have to wonder and question. But is the rest of the bigger picture of value? And it's one thing with Castaneda that you can really say. The philosophical understandings, the statements, the terminologies used are really excellent and very thought-provoking and philosophically profound. Generally, you don't find that from other people who do metaphysical or occult things. When they do make mistakes, instead of just saying, well, that's their own style and tradition, they don't really have the bigger picture. It's just basically they're making money off of it, and then they're doing things wrong to begin with. And they're not based in anything, and they can't explain it. Like the evocation of spirits only in your head, like some buffoons on the internet are saying it. Yet we all know that you can see spirits and manifest them to visible. But it's very difficult, and certainly not up to the level that can be done by these idiots on the internet that are making millions from a lot of people that, of course, are more than happy to give them the money to live in a fantasy world, apparently. And of course, if you're going to be an occultist and you're going to be a man of mystery like Castaneda was, you don't want to sit out there and say, yeah, I was born this time, I did this, I was sick when I was 12. The point is giving this mundane history to explain what is happening in a very profound and occult manner is really inappropriate and a waste of time, other than, again, there are big picture things. Who is this guy? Where is he from? What is his background? I think those things are important. But ultimately, this weaves into the bigger picture and what someone has produced. Now, is the knowledge there good? Whether he was a man of great empowerment has nothing to do with the fact of what he experienced and what he's teaching. One person can become very, very empowered. and another one can't. And most teachers are in general have a level of empowerment, but they are very much caught into and have to perform as teachers. So they're constantly laying things out, training, telling people what to do, and in many instances they don't have any time for themselves at all or to develop their own empowerment to higher levels. And this is a conundrum of that experts get caught into, and something as a teacher myself I have to fight constantly against as well, to make sure I'm doing my own practices and working on my own empowerments and not helping everybody else and ignoring my own needs. And so the whole idea is that some of your students will go to high levels of empowerment, other ones will not. And that's the nature of everything. But that's the nature of everything. There are some people who become doctors who are complete dangerous idiots that their license have to be taken away. After all the stress and training they went through in school and everything else, they still don't get it. There are other people that don't necessarily have their license taken away, but they're mediocre doctors. Then there are ones that are amazing. And this goes to every single field. There are good lawyers and there are really bad lawyers. And you name it. There's some people that can fix cars really great. Other ones that are just, I follow the book. It works, 60% of the time. And then there are those that, can tell you exactly what's wrong with something because they are masters of what they do. So, I don't like the fact that you clarify that only occultism is this nebulous area. Well, it's nebulous because of the nature of the manifestations from it. Since you don't have a car to fix, it's hard to say whether you did that magical operation perfectly or not, because measuring the manifestations of it are much more difficult. So to poo-poo this person because of his lifestyle, because of his potential social activities, apparently it was thought that his death certificate states that he was never married. So the people who came out, I'm not sure which one of his ex-wives came out and talked about this, or of course it wasn't his ex-wife, it was not even a wife, it was a girlfriend who probably resented and wasn't left much of the will. I'm not sure where that will is and who got what or where. I can't find information there. And while it's interesting, it's not worth the time to research. If anybody can find that out, let me know where Castaneda's fortune is going to. Apparently his one and only son, which apparently wasn't even his biological father, but he claimed him as a son, another of this typical thing. But it's very typical people who are not 9-to-5er, blue tie, white shirt wearing executive types don't necessarily have very traceable backgrounds, nor do they value all the stupid traditions of common society called marriages and everything else. So it's not really that unusual to be done. This kind of formal structure fits usually the basic sand grain mentality mind of the common people. So it doesn't really fit those in the occult or metaphysical world's understanding of reality, which is way past a little certificate or what society thinks is good. But the point is that the checks for his royalties must be going somewhere, and it would be really interesting to know who got that. Some sort of will was made 2 days before he died, when he was in horrible, horrible state, which means he basically wasn't even mentally functioning, being this close to death. And a matter of fact, 2 days before he died, he wasn't even in a conscious state, it was alleged. So how could he have even made that? So it's another interesting, intriguing aspect. But, there must be an awful lot of money there. You're talking about millions and millions of books that were sold and are selling. And it's a basic industry into itself of people who've written books carrying on for him. And he himself stayed out of the limelight quite a bit towards the end of his years, even though there was a rebirth for a while of these particular Toltec movements, positions that created energy, and which he had something to do with, but apparently was set up by a whole nother corporation of people. And he never appeared in these videos that were made showing these kind of Toltec yoga, I guess we could call it. Of course, yoga is more physical, while these were more energetic. But of course, there's a great aspect of yoga that is energetic as well. to look at this person from a common society, quote, common, and I like to use the term common scientific, because real science doesn't look at things like that. Real science knows it's fraud and understands that, and understands that science is nothing more than an educated guess. But to look at him from a common scientific level and to judge him by the common world, I think is a big mistake. And any author and any person of mystical energy and someone who writes 12 books on this particular subject, who went through all these, and I do believe he went through a lot of this, whether all this information and the things happened as they did, we don't really know, especially, as I said, since you're using hallucinogens anyway. And this is the problem with hallucinogens: what is real and what is not real. And that's hard enough to figure out in common consciousness, more or less, when you deliberately distort it. So the idea is that doing all this and then putting it together, and you certainly could spend, half a book writing how the negative effects of peyote and the vomiting and puking and all the other wonderful things that go with the use of that would make a great bestseller. Maybe he could have photographed his personal vomit at different times and then analyzed it, or had a scientist tell him what was in it. So the whole idea is that these things are not going to be something that is in any way beneficial to a person writing about this. If you write about something and nobody reads it, it doesn't really have much value. But everything is entertainment on a certain level. And this goes back to the ancient times, is that so many things that were talked about as miracles and things that in paganism and throughout all the Bibles and all the other stories out there were all added to make them interesting, to keep people's attention. So it's just not cerebral, philosophical worship. It's about, well, this person we should worship because they walk on water. Well, you can guarantee that never happened. So these things are all put in there for people to do that. So the idea is that to see it as something that is striking and profound, something that's different, not in a understanding on a deep inner way, because that proves nothing, but in a gross, illusionary, comic-y, magician type way, illusion magicians. The David Copperfield way of doing things gets attention. And you do need to get people's attention. So that's all part of any stories and anything that's been maintained from ancient times. There's a huge element of all this, and we have absolutely no idea, and most probably it is not correct whatsoever. So there's no way of tracing any of this to knowing anything, not to mention that all these things were generally written down when it comes to any person who's been deified hundreds and hundreds of years after the events happened. In many, many cases. Even other ones that are written are 10, 20 years after the events happen, which has been claimed with some of the apostles. But, what do you remember for 10 years? Do you remember all the details? Come on. It's a little bit ridiculous. And, of course, how much Hollywood do you have to put it in there if you're going to tell people about it? You're certainly not going to go into how nice it is to ascend and be. That's not going to buy you much. You're walking on water. Ooh, what was that? That sounds interesting. So, we need to understand that and understand the bigger picture, which I think a lot of people in the common consumer world, you listening to this that are learning and educated, tend to overlook the understanding of the business aspects of anybody who's into anything. And as I said, Uri Geller is a prime example of the fact that you better do you want to make a living? You better do some showmanship, man. And that's exactly what has been done. So you blend in magic, theatrical magic, in with other energies as well. And that's just doing your audience a service and doing you. And then, of course, you do like all the regular con artists, tricksters, SOB magicians do, and you give it an air of, yeah, it could be real. Of course, they even tell you most of the time that this ain't a trick, this is what I do, like was stated by a famous magician on TV, Chris Angel. So the whole idea is that the bottom line is that we need to understand this aspects of things. And of course, it's the occultists. You can get fooled by all these multi-millionaires that get millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars every year to play in Vegas. And they can fool you, and you can pay them $150 a ticket. But if an occultist goes out and does something or talks about that, well, you're just a fraud, and we're going to expose you. Yeah, that's called protecting your own business field, isn't it, on Amazing Randy? So the whole bottom line is that this has to be understood by particularly the public, that things have to be made interesting. And the line is how much do you cross that and get into what's considered fraud, which is misrepresenting entirely instead of making something more interesting. And this is the problem in most fields. I would say every field. Does a car or a product or a blender do what they really tell you it does on TV? Does it really work like that in day-to-day life? And well, yeah, if everything is done perfectly, which you're never going to do and the average consumer will never do, but they're going to show you that on TV in a very controlled way. Yes, you can produce this kind of results. Is that going to be common? Hell no, baby. That ain't going to happen at home. You ain't going to do that in your kitchen. You're not going to have that perfectly chilled item, that perfectly dense piece of fruit or whatever it is you're grinding or chopping. It isn't going to happen. So the whole idea is that we have to be very careful with all these things, and how we judge people and so forth, and what is added to as artistic license, as it's called, meaning the fact that to better explain and to make something more interesting, you add a little nice icing to that maybe wasn't there. And he even, Castaneda, admitted to doing some of this, and of course, there's personal discrepancies in his personal history and other things. People love to point this out. Well, you weren't really in Mexico in 1956. I showed that you were here and you got a treatment at this hospital for something. Well, yeah, maybe you got the year wrong. Maybe it wasn't 56. Maybe it was 57 that you were in Mexico and did something. And of course, the person writing this doesn't really mean that much to them. You're not categorizing this as some scientific study. And of course, we know how great those scientific studies are, particularly when it comes to drugs who kill people by the millions, but they were tested scientifically. Yeah, we got it written down. Killed lots of people. Yeah, that's right. Right here. So the whole idea is that we need to understand these types of things. And as a person on the, as was told to me by one business teacher, at one time, we got to understand the people like you on the other side of the cash register who never really know what being on the receiving end of a cash register is, because you've never really been there. So people need to understand that. People need to make a living. If everybody, as I've always stated, could be taken care of and placed into proper research institutions where they were supported and could not be affected by the pressures of surviving in society, we'd have a much better reality going on here. So it's important to understand that. It's important as a consumer to understand that is the core of this true, and are some of these details in here questionable? Well, that's how you have to look at things, or you have to have the educated knowledge to say that. And you can't dismiss everything. This is just fantasy nonsense. This is comic books. And you certainly can't say, man, look at this. It's so perfect. I'm going to go take peyote and go fly through the air. I mean, you get a whole bunch of people who really want that to happen and believe that verbatim of what's being stated. And that's not true either. It's always a middle ground, and the golden mean, as has been stated by the ancient Greeks, where it comes from, is really it. The golden mean, the proper center ground of understanding and wisdom, is where everything comes from. So you've got to judge all literature like that. But we get into his actual practices and other things and so forth that he claimed he learned in northern Mexico from some sort of shaman. Of course, it makes it easy for him because he was located now or living in California, Mexico. We're not really sure where he was all this time, how he was surviving, etc. So some of this can be traced but it fits into his immigration into North America and his actual practices at that time. So it's not related to any deeper than northern Mexico in terms of geographical location or potential information, which is critical because information stays regionally. We do have to understand that, based on the information that we have, that he moved to America in the 50s, which means he was in his 20s. If he was born in 25, if he moved in 1950, which of course would obviously be 25 at that time, became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 57. So that would make him about 30, would make him 32. So, and of course, it takes at least 5 years to become an American citizen. So the point is that he had 25 years outside of the United States growing up wherever. Now, we must assume that he got some knowledge and information from his native Peru area, which is more based in the Mayans that I'm talking about. So it's really unclear of where all his information comes from. It's hard for me to believe this came from a northern Mexican tradition, considering how witchcrafty and primitive most of that is, based in the Santeria, voodoo-ish, animal sacrificing, very primitive but very common witchcraft shamanic traditions. That this philosophy would be about going into these things that he came up with. So it's a very intellectual look based on hallucinogens and other things, which I'm assuming was used and is a tradition throughout these cultural aspects, and there are good reasons for that, and we go into that in our discussion on magic and drugs in general. But I mean, these are all things to keep in mind. But as I've said, if you go through the books and you're looking for actual practices of what to do in terms of past just taking these shamanic journeys, then you need to. You're going to be sadly disappointed because. It's been a long time, but I know I did this at one time, and I could come up with basically nothing. He claimed you could walk long distances if you kind of keep your hands in a loose fist. I've been trying that for 20 years now, and it don't seem to work. I was grasping for every possible, really practical information there, and I'm not sure there's much practical we gained out of that. I think the philosophical trainings in his books are excellent, the way of thinking, the energies, the aspects that are out there, his statements on this kind of energy that draws and vampires people, I think is really profound and very interesting. And I have to wonder, where did he get that information from? Of course, a lot of this is very typical shamanic training, and shamanism in itself is very universal. I mean, shamans in Peru and shamans in American Indians, shamans around the world in India, even shamans in Europe do very similar practices. They're very, very similar. They're working with nature and nature's energies and plants and other things. And these are all very similar. What changes a lot is the actual plants themselves. But a lot of the procedures are very, very similar. And it makes sense if you're dealing with the same thing. The way a metal worker works in India and a metal worker works in the United States is very, very similar. While there may be different techniques and fancier technologies, the basic process of doing things is very, very similar. So that's to be understood as well. But I don't think in any way that we can look at these things in a straight scientific fashion and get anything out of it. And that's who all of his critics are. And there are some people that are more New Agey anthropology types, but I also think, as in most people who are people of letters, those educated people who spend 20 years in educational institutions, being programmed to think in a particular fashion, are are always highly jealous of anybody who really has success, particularly in the publishing area, because all of science and academia is based on the fact of publishing papers and getting recognition for them. And generally, very little money ever comes from that. But if you can, and you get into the public spotlight, like a lot of different scientists and other people who have written books, Carl Sagan, and other people who have had million sellers, I think there's a great hatred and resentment to those people that they were able to do it with because they had a style and a way of doing things. Carl Sagan with his billions and billions and his PBS TV series, he became a celebrity. And I think people who say, well, I know a lot more than he does. And because he's a little weird and he wrote this book, he gets all the credit, and all of us in this industry hasn't. And there's a natural wanting to criticize and jealousy there. So, these are all things that people have to understand in the entire field of all this stuff. And the billions and billions of fields out there. So the whole idea is that all of these things have to be considered in terms of what's going on with this particular person. Now, was this a great person of power? Well, I mean, he did sell a lot of books in a very common world, in a very common media, and I don't think that has anything to do with his personal empowerment. So, as a matter of fact, I don't think it has anything to do with it at all. And I don't think he empowered the books or in any way. It was a lot of luck, but it could have been spiritually empowered as well. The fact that a university press would publish these books and that they would catch on and do so well. But of course, that was the nature of the time again. Colleges were highly valued, particularly because of the Vietnam War going on. And because of the Vietnam War going on, anybody who had a brain was basically in college, so they would not be drafted. And that was one way to get out of the draft. So the point is that anybody of any kind of consciousness was in there. And this is where people didn't look to the general controlled garbage media, which at that particular time was even more and very difficult to get anything published. Unlike today, which of course is the complete opposite, where anybody can publish anything. But they didn't even have the publishing houses back then, and it was very difficult, as it still is, to get a book published by a large distributor, even these new age distributors that are out there today. So the idea is that all this is part of the process of understanding what was going on. So the point is that he became very popular at a perfect time, writing about drugs and LSD and everything else when everybody was into that, churning in this philosophy, magic, which is people were looking for alternatives, and it was just the right thing of everything. And I'm sure there was an occult aspect of the empowerment as well. I don't know if it was directly done by him or not. Certainly could have been, but certainly is a fascinating area. So the point is that this guy, he sold 28 million copies of his books. So that's quite impressive amount of having 12 books in general is pretty good for an author, and all the spin-offs of people who have made money off of him and criticizing him. So it certainly is fascinating. We can't in any way discredit somebody for that unless this really is just complete and total junk, but everyone says this of every one of these authors. I forget the guy who claimed to have been in Tibet and everything else that wrote these books, a British person, Lamsak, I guess, Lamsa, something like that. Which again, I feel are excellent books, which give excellent information. Now, whether he was there or not, and whether this all happened in his mind, well, isn't everything in the mind anyway? What is that? I mean, we're not talking about someone producing a physical product here. We're talking about a spiritual journey and quest, and we should be open to any of these things, but we should not be blind believers. And we've always said this, question everything and believe nothing. So you should definitely work from that particular aspect of taking in information. But that is not a negative statement in the fact of saying, well, everything is crap. Look at it. If you're looking at things from a scientific viewpoint, then you are making a big mistake to begin with, because the reality of a scientific viewpoint is a very negative viewpoint that has little or no value. So it is important that you stay away from that kind of actual interpretation of things, and look for the greater understanding, and cut through some of the entertainment, cut through some of the nonsensical things. We don't know if editors and publishers have added stuff into books to make them more exciting or not. This is very typical. Most publishers change things, just like television shows and documentaries put stuff in that are totally bogus just to make a sensation. So that needs to be understood. But as a general contribution to this field of occultism, I think these are excellent works. And there's, in terms of the philosophical, taking the drugs and other things out of these things, there are some very excellent information there, which I consider to be very high quality. In terms of practical information, as I said, I don't see much there. In terms of the using drugs, that's a whole subject matter to itself, and to encapsulate that just a wee bit here, since we're mired in this subject, the use of hallucinogens is a very dangerous path to go down, in terms of the fact of, what are you experiencing? Is any of that real, and how can that be judged? I'm a firm believer in altering your consciousness to as radical as you can without breaking your consciousness from common reality. You need to be living in the common world that you're functioning in, and being able to break your connection with it to control that common. But when you get to the point where you don't know the difference between the two, and a substance is telling you or activating things within your mind, there has to be a whole bunch of questions there of, is this strictly psychically brain-based chemical reactions causing all this? And your mind is just such full of garbage that it is almost valueless in tapping into that or getting these kind of gross readings from. So, the value of that, while I think there may be some value in ayahuasca and so forth, I'm not sure that these type of things have value. Now, shamans have used these so they can understand and break from the common world, not necessarily getting exact information, but just to kind of force you to think differently. And American Indians used to do this commonly. They would starve themselves to death, not to death, but would starve themselves, not drink water, and they'd get hallucinations from going through death throes. And this again, they would see the world in a different way. Well, I think we're past a lot of that stuff. But of course, having a violent psychic reaction to the world and showing you things that are completely different can have a transforming effect on the average person who really is just stuck in the mire of stupidity. So they need to be shown in a very dramatic psychic way that there's something very strange going on. So the effects of that can be, if done under proper situations around professionals. I have problems with people doing this on their own, because it seems to me it's a dangerous practice unless you have someone who can guide you through the process. After all, Castaneda had Don Juan, who was guiding him step by step through all of this, and he wasn't doing this just going out into the desert and by himself. So I think that's an important lesson to understand, and something that anyone who goes on this kind of shamanic journey should be doing it with someone of particular skill that knows what's happening. And it's not about partying, it's about accessing sacred and profound knowledge. But I would say in general that I highly recommend Castaneda's books, and that people should read them all and take them in the vein that they were meant to be, more as a philosophical understanding the powers, understanding how people interrelate with them. And there's so many things that are brought up in his books, which I find extremely fascinating, particularly, as I said, the concepts of the spiritual teachings. So it's very important that you relate to things in that particular fashion, and understand that these books were written for that particular point, and not to look at them as some sort of scientific text or some training manual or some excuse to take hallucinogens. So with that, as I always say, there is no reality until the occult scientist creates it. Question everything, believe nothing, and let the guild be your guide.